I'm Tom Cressman, and I'm sure you all are tied in because you got the announcement somehow, so you know a little bit about me. I've been at NASA for a long time. This talk, or series of talks, is based on a talk I gave to the young adults at my church, and a lot of people found it helpful, so I thought maybe I could give it at work in a series of lunchtime talks. I'd like to start by introducing you to my dad. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 95. My dad was a geologist, and he loved his work. He was a field geologist. We'd camp out all summer when I was younger, and he loved his job. He says, "Tom, I can't believe they pay me to do this job. I enjoy it so much I do it anyway, even if they didn't pay me." And we'd be driving through the mountains. He would explain some of the wonders that he would see about these plates moving together and these mountains be pushed up, and oh, here's an intrusion here and the cracks of ancient rock and so forth. So he, of course, would talk about, "Tom, you talk about 1,000,000 years, that's nothing to a geologist. The earth is so old," and so forth. But my dad was also a believer in Jesus Christ. Read something from his memoirs. He grew up in the Lutheran Church. He took a catechism class, which is typical of people in many churches. He said one clear night, winter night, as he was returning home from the class, he stopped to look at the stars. Orion strode across the southern sky, and Sirius twinkled near the horizon. To the north, the Big Dipper stretched across the west, and Cassiopeia hung in the east, both guiding toward Polaris. The Milky Way was a highway of glory that stretched from northeast to southwest across the sky. And as I looked in wonder, he said, it came to me that if what we were being taught were true, the gospel was indeed the most important fact in the universe. And since that time, I have never doubted the Christian faith, and it has been the basic presupposition with which I have viewed the world and within which I have lived my life. So my dad was a believer, and he brought us up in the church. And of course, I was brought up in that kind of environment. I didn't see any fundamental contradiction between science and what he was telling me and so forth, and what the Bible said. But things really didn't click for me until I was in my first year of college. And as I began to see my need for a Savior and something that would give meaning beyond, I didn't see this life as enough to satisfy, to be fulfilling, to be rewarding in any ultimate sense, that I started searching for the heart of Christianity. And that's because I saw the reality of Christ in friends and in my sister, too, who had become a believer. And so as I searched, God opened my eyes, and I began to see who Jesus really was, and that the heart of Christianity was really a relationship with Him. And I remember one night I was alone in my bedroom, and I all of a sudden I just realized, I knew in my heart that Jesus was all that He claimed to be, that of course He rose from the dead, and of course He would come into my life if I asked Him to. And so that's what I did. Alone in my bedroom, I asked Jesus Christ to come into my life and to save me and to make me into the kind of person He wanted to be. And that decision turned out to be the defining moment in my life. It set the whole direction of my life, the whole tenor of it, the whole purpose of it. So when I went off to the University of Cincinnati and left my church that I grew up in, I got involved in other Christian fellowships, and I was surprised when I encountered Christians that seemed to think that there was this big conflict between science and the Bible, and somehow the science and the Bible were not compatible. And so that started me seeking, well, is that really true? What's the case? And so what I want to do is during these talks is kind of share some of the things on how the science affirms the Bible and how it's also vice versa. The Bible affirms science. In fact, the Bible really doesn't need science's affirmation. It stands on its own, and it affirms itself. And there's enough evidence in there for you to know that God is for real and so forth. But science also affirms it, and the Bible affirms science. So the first thing I want to make is that God has revealed Himself through what He has made. That's called general revelation. So I go to Psalm 19. In the Old Testament, this psalm was written 3,000 years ago by David. And as David looked up, he said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, and night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." And so the Bible says that God reveals himself, something about himself, through what he has made, through creation. And he gives the example of the stars. In that psalm, it tells us there's another revelation too, and that's the revelation of his word, the Bible. And it talks about general revelation pointing to that special revelation, which is the written word, which we call the Bible, and how God's laws are pure and they're righteous and they're holy and they're able to save us and so forth. And it's just this hymn, this psalm of praise to God's ways, and as he reveals them in his word. And so we have these two aspects of revelation. God reveals himself through nature, and he reveals himself through his word, the Bible. People can have two different responses to revelation, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in nature. I want to read to you from an article I read on Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was the first mission to loop around the moon with people in it. And it's the first time anybody saw the Earth rising above the horizon of the moon. And as the article says, it says, few know of the mission's long-term effects on its three crewmen. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, seeing the distant Earth from lunar orbit, strengthened their conviction that the human beings existed for a purpose. From 250,000 miles away, Lovell told the world on Christmas Eve, 1968, the Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space. For Bill Anders, however, who took the Earthrise photo, this same view had the opposite effect. The Earth, so tiny and isolated within the cold emptiness of space, suggested a lonely purposelessness. Having abandoned the Catholic rituals that he had once held dear, he later described the vague impression that had begun in lunar orbit. We like ants. We are like ants on a log. And so two different responses. This is, again, another principle you'll see talked about in the Bible. God gives his revelation, but people can have two responses. It says in the book of Romans that God has revealed himself through creation, that he's made it clear that he exists, and so forth. And men are without excuse, that there's enough evidence from creation to know that he exists and to know of his deity and his power. And yet the people can reject that. In this case, men refuse to give thanks or acknowledge God as God, and so their foolish hearts were darkened. And it's a pretty good description of the condition of mankind. And Jesus himself, their people had two different reactions to him. When they saw him, some loved him, they embraced him, and others rejected him and hated him. And it said that Mary was told that Jesus, when he came, would reveal the thoughts of many hearts. And so Revelation tells us something about God, but our response to Revelation tells us something about ourselves. So what is science? Science is the application of reason and observation to discover objective truths about the physical world. So everybody practices science in one sense, but of course people who we call scientists, they have special instruments for observation, and they have special tools for reasoning, and I would call it the discipline of mathematics. So what is the domain of science? So if you look at this Venn diagram, the white area is truth in all its totality. And I would say that this is infinite because God is infinite and there's infinite truths about him. But a subset of that truth is truth pertaining to the physical world. And of that, a certain amount of truth is discoverable through science. So that's the domain of science. Science pertains to the physical world, and that is part of the truth that exists, but there's much more truth than what's just about the physical world. Are science and faith compatible? I get this all the time. What? You mean there are Christians at NASA? Talk to different folks at church and elsewhere. Yes, they are compatible. First of all, faith is required for science. Science requires the adoption of certain presuppositions that reality is objective, that the world is rational and operates according to rational principles, and that we as humans have the ability to understand it. And these are rooted in the biblical view of who God is and what he made man to be in his own image. And so these beliefs became the seedbed for the development of science as we have it today. So scientists also hold many beliefs based on the authorities of others, just like the rest of us. Well, that's a form of faith. We have faith in these other authorities. In fact, that's how science makes progress, by building on, standing upon the shoulders of great men and women in the past. And scientists exercise the kind of faith that makes personal relationships possible. Faith is necessary for personal relationships. So scientist, if he has a healthy marriage and family, he exercises faith in his wife and in his kids, and it goes the other way around. And that's the same kind of faith that makes our relationship with Christ possible. It's the faith of personal relationships. We trust a person. So scientific investigation can be an act of worship as we discover new things about nature. It reveals to us God's glory and his power, just as it talked about in Psalm 1. Okay, what about the church and science? The Judeo-Christian belief in a rational, transcendent creator who created man in his image became the seedbed for the growth of science. And the church has, from ancient times, been a positive influence of science, has promoted it in other intellectual pursuits. So the church was instrumental in establishing universities, in funding scholars, and then the development of logic systems that were appropriate for science. Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler were all Christians. And you can see this quote from Augustine, so the first millennium AD. And he expressed the confidence to discover the book of nature because it's the production of the Creator. So being in God's image, we should be able to read the book of nature. And he insisted that we should proceed by most certain reasoning or experience to discern the most likely way that God established the nature of things. Well, hey, that's science. All right, so we have this idea today that the church has been at war with science and vice versa throughout the ages, and this is promoted in the Modern Cosmos series and some textbooks and so forth. So one of the myths is that the church brought on the Dark Ages. Well, it didn't. In fact, the church throughout the Middle Ages preserved knowledge, promoted universities, and affirmed science. Another thing you'll hear is that Copernicus, when he came up with his theory with the sun being in the middle of the universe rather than the earth, it shook up the Judeo-Christian worldview and the religious establishment. In fact, it did not. The ancients, including theologians, knew the universe was vast and the earth was round. And in fact, in the view of many, Copernicus did not demote Earth. He promoted it from the bottom of the universe. The center was the bottom of the universe, the held in the middle. Another myth is that church persecuted Galileo because he contradicted church teachings. Well, it turns out that most astronomers opposed the heliocentric view, not on theological but for scientific reasons, and Galileo failed to prove that the Earth orbited the sun. That came later, but he wanted to teach it as fact. And, bad thing, he insulted a former friend, the Pope. And Galileo was not tortured. He continued to receive a pension for the rest of his life, although he was under house arrest. Another myth that's propagated is a monk by the name of Bruno, that he was burned at the stake, which he was because he believed in many worlds and with intelligent life. So again, another example of science and church in opposition to one another. Well, first of all, Bruno was not a scientist. The idea of many worlds and intelligent life elsewhere was not considered heresy. It had been discussed by theologians and others before. But Bruno held beliefs that were contrary to the fundamental doctrines of the Trinity and the work of Christ. So he was a heretic, and that's why he was burned at the stake. So back then, when you dealt with ideas that were dangerous and harmful, you burned people at the stake. These days, we assassinate their reputation in the press. I'm not saying that they were right to execute Bruno. Obviously, they weren't, but that's just the way things worked back then. So what about today? Well, there is a lot of tension between science and the Bible today, and I would attribute it to the rise of scientific materialism. So this is a different worldview. Notice this Venn diagram. All truth, the only thing that exists is the material world. There's nothing outside of that. And so a subset of that is truth discoverable through science. Well, included in that is mind, morality, religion, and the arts. So mind, morality, religion, and the arts are at their foundation materialistic phenomena. There's nothing spiritual and nothing beyond the material world in that. So now all these areas become subject to science and not the other way around. So this has led to a lot of attention over the years. It's actually had a devastating influence on our culture. So beware of the materialist narrative. So you see it in this mural that I took at a museum out west in Seattle. So I would call this our modern creation myth, so to speak. So here you have at the beginning, you have the lightning striking the primordial pool and life spontaneously arising. You see the DNA helix over there and jellyfishes slowly developing from microorganisms into plants and animals as it continues its march of progress. And then in the middle here you have man. So you have man evolving from animals, apes in particular, and result in the pinnacle, so to speak. So this is man in all his glory. Notice that Eve has her hair curled and her legs shaved, and notice that Adam has his face shaved too, and notice, of course, that they're white. To the right are all the great figures of history and the development of civilization and so forth. Notice that they're all scientists. They are not religious figures. You can see Newton and Galileo and so forth, Kepler. You can see Robert Goddard, the father of the liquid fuel rocket, and Einstein. Well, what's the future? Well, the future is glorious. We're going to conquer the universe. And this take various forms. Today we have what we call the alien enlightened myth, that we're going to discover aliens elsewhere in the universe and they'll be like God to us. And they're going to bring salvation to the human race. Or computer technology is going to develop where we have the singularity, and computers are going to basically save us and give us immortality. This is the materialist narrative. There's many different forms of it, but it has had a tremendous impact on our society. So materialism is basically the dominant religion of Western culture. And other religions are tolerated by relegating them to personal preference, as long as they stay in their place and don't impact the world. And I'm sure you feel that sometimes you're afraid to speak out about certain things. And, religion is basically relegated to the realm of personal opinion. So that's the materialist narrative, and there's many different forms of it. What about the biblical narrative? The Bible forms a complete narrative from beginning to end. The Bible begins, and the first verse is, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And it gives the creation of the world in a framework of 7 days. Some people ask me, well, are those 7 literal days, or are they 7 ages? I like to think of it in terms of a literary framework that gives us certain truths. You notice day 1 is the creation of day, night, and yet day 4 is sun, moon, and stars. To me, that gives you an indication that maybe you don't have to interpret this literally. And I think when we get tied up, are these literal days or the ages or whatever, we're kind of missing the biggest points from the Genesis account of creation. The first thing is that in the beginning, God was already there in the beginning. So he's eternal, he's infinite, and so forth. He was already there at the beginning of all things. And then he created the heavens and the earth. In other words, he created all things. And he created how? By speaking things into existence. He just spoke and they came to be. He said, let there be light. Let there be this. Let there be that. And so forth. So God spoke the world, the universe into existence. And so that gives extra significance to when we go to the Gospel of John, and where it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were created through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That's referring to the Lord Jesus, because the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So you see that connection all the way back to the creation of the world. And the next thing I want to point out is that everything God created was good, this repeated refrain. And God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. So what God created was good. Thirdly, what's the first thing God created? He said, let there be light. God is the source of all light. God himself is light. That's referring to his righteousness, I think, primarily. But God is light. God created all light. He created physical light. He created intellectual light, spiritual light. So if we want light, what do? We go to God. God is the source of light. Every good and perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of light. So God created space and time. Notice those first 3 days are separations, or 3 great separations. Day and night, or light and dark, day and night, sky and ocean, and then dry land and plants. So those 3 great separations. Then the next 3 days, he's filling those spaces. So God created the things that occupied space and time, whether they're planetary bodies, whether they're creatures that are swimming and flying, whether they're man himself. The next thing I want you to notice is what it says about man. He says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. So it repeats, in his image, in his likeness. God made mankind in his own image, and in the image of God. He created them, male and female. He created. So it's key, when he created humankind, he created man and woman as the image of God. If you want to know what God's like, you look at people. And lastly, he created rest. He created space for us to worship. God wants a relationship with us. He created us for a relationship. All right. So those, I think, are the big takeaways from the beginning of the grand story of the Bible. Well, now that's Genesis chapter 1. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 focuses on the creation of man, and it's a very intimate picture. God takes the dust of the earth and he forms it into a human being. He forms it into the man. I think of a sculptor working on a clay sculpture. Of course, the sculptor's done, and it's still just a thing. It's not a person, but God breathed into the man the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So all life comes from God. Our life came from God. If we want, God is life in a sense. That is, he has life in himself. He didn't get it from anywhere else. He has life in himself. And if we want life, where do we go? We go to God. God is the source of life. He's the one that gives us life. Secondly, God created marriage. He created the first woman as well as the first man. And then that story about the creation of woman, it gives us some insight into the relationship between a husband and a wife. And marriage was good. And he put man in the perfect environment, and he gave him the gift of choice. The man and his wife could eat anything that was in this garden that was created for them. They could have anything, whatever they wanted. There's only one thing they couldn't have, and that was this one particular fruit on this particular tree. Any other fruit they could choose, but they could also choose to disobey a command of God. So this kind of sets up for Genesis chapter 3, which talks about the origin of evil. So the question is, let's do a reality check. We have the materialist narrative and the biblical narrative. So is there an all-powerful transcendent creator? Of course, the materialist narrative would say no. But I think most of us know in our heart of hearts that yes, there is a transcendent creator. Is the impression of design in nature an illusion or real? We look at nature, we look at life, and even little kids, even kids of atheists, and I have an article maybe I'll share later about, conclude they can perceive design. They have to be taught not to. Even evolutionists like Dawkins, militant atheists, will say there is this appearance of design. So is it an illusion or is it real? All right, are humans a difference of degree or a difference of kind from the rest of the world? Are we just kind of souped up apes, or are we something different because we are created in the image of God? All right, do we have free will? Well, the materialist narrative would say that free will is really an illusion. We don't have free will. In fact, in reality, we aren't rational creatures. We cannot really know truth and so forth. So these are some of the implications of the materialist narrative. But do we have free will? Yes, we do. I think we all know that we do. We can choose, and we can make good choices, and we can make bad choices. All right. Do we have purpose, meaning, and ultimate value? We are built so that we have to have purpose. It's important for us to have meaning and ultimate value. We need these things. My dog does not need to know his purpose in life. He doesn't need a sense of meaning or an ultimate value. But we as human beings, created in the image of God, in ourselves, we need purpose. We need meaning. We need ultimate value. We ask those kind of questions. These questions are meaningless from a materialist perspective. All right, what about marriage? Is marriage just a legal arrangement? Or is it something more, even mystical? I think the Bible indicates that there's something mystical about it. It says the man and a wife, they became one flesh. All right, next question. What about right and wrong? Are they just human inventions? Well, if the materialist narrative is true, they're simply human inventions. So you say it's wrong, I say it's right. Who's right and who's wrong? Neither, right? They're just things that we made up. They really don't exist. So that means evil doesn't exist because the categories of good and evil don't exist because the material universe is all there is. So I would claim that the biblical narrative makes sense with our own experience. Now we're going to talk about this more. We're going to talk about physics next week, and the next week after that, life, and after that, anthropology. So hope you stay tuned for that.
Day after day, they pour forth speech, and night after champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is hidden from its heat. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, and night after night they display knowledge. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned. In keeping them there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me, then I will be blameless, innocent of great transgression. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my Redeemer. Psalm 19.